Kamala Harris's loss, a stunning defeat for Democrats.
I'm just devastated.
A somber mood at Harris's watch party overnight after Donald Trump dominated, blowing through the so-called blue wall of Midwest states that Democrats had counted on. Improving on his 2020 margins in more than 2,000 counties nationwide. In the key swing state of Pennsylvania, Harris underperforming President Biden's results. And further down the ballot, Republicans also flipped the Senate to their side.
America has given us an unprecedented and powerful mandate.
Now for Democrats, the soul-searching begins. After an unprecedented race with Harris stepping in as the presidential candidate, just 100 days ago when President Biden withdrew, Harris tried to distance herself from Biden, but perhaps was still hampered by his legacy.
This is about what the Democrats did while in office over the last 4 years. Inflation, which was so high during much of this administration, and many people are still feeling the pain of that.
Exit polls show voters listed the economy as a major issue. Harris also underperforming in key areas.
Where she's coming up short are in the cities.
Even struggling in blue strongholds like New York and Virginia, despite a massive campaign blitz from major Democratic stars. Harris also came up short with key minority groups. According to exit polls, Latino men favoring Trump by a 10-point margin, after backing President Biden by 23 points 4 years ago. Democrats now face an uphill battle.
And we know it is time for a new generation of leadership in America.
With Harris's message clearly not resonating with enough voters, Democrats are now left trying to sort out how to turn the page now.
And already you're beginning to hear questions in terms of that Monday morning, or in this case Wednesday morning, quarterbacking among Democrats. Among the questions right now, whether it would have made better sense for President Biden after Democratic successes in the midterms in 2022 to have stepped down then. Remember, he promised to be a transitional president in the past to allow for a full primary for the Democrats to pick their candidate going forward, and perhaps to give that candidate more time to gear up for this battle with Donald Trump. And the bottom line is there are so many questions, so few answers, and the Democrats have a lot of figuring out what to do next that begins right now.
All right, Peter, thank you so much. We return to Hallie Jackson and Kristen Welker. So let's talk about that. There was going to be a lot of soul searching and hand wringing and probably some finger pointing. And let's just start where Peter brought it up. I mean, is the original sin here that Biden stayed in the race when perhaps he should have stepped aside and had an open primary, and perhaps Democrats would have had a better shot? Is that one of the lessons Democrats are talking about?
Absolutely. It's one of the things that Democrats are talking about, the timing of when he stepped aside, because remember, there was so much debate, even when he did step down in the summer, about potentially holding an open primary. Could that have made Vice President Harris a stronger candidate if she were the one who had emerged at the top of the ticket after a robust primary process? And also that condensed period of campaigning deprived her, I think, of the long runway that a typical candidate has to really lay out what they see their vision as if they were to win office.
I mean, Trump winning the popular vote right now, the map looks almost all red. And there were a lot of things the Harris campaign was counting on. They were counting on a lot of women coming out. Yeah. They were probably counting on a lot of minorities coming out. A lot of them did come out, but many of them came out for Trump.
That's right. And not enough of them came out for her. I spoke with one person close with her, I want to say 12 hours before polls closed, maybe it was 18 hours before polls closed, who said, listen, I think we are going to see less of an underperformance with Black and Latino voters than people are predicting here because of what they had been seeing. That was simply not the case, right? Because we see it in these exit polls and we see it in the results in these counties after county where you've seen, very blue in 2016, less blue in 2020, red in this year in places like Texas, right? Some of these heavily Latino counties in parts of Texas here. What's so interesting, and Savannah and Hoda, we talk about this, and you've said this on other contexts and other nights, is having a bit of humility here. And I do think that as journalists, political pundits out there, et cetera, there will have to be a reckoning inside the Democratic Party, but we don't yet fully know what that looks like, right? I think we can sense the contours of it, that is going to have to exist, but it could go in a lot of different directions because there are some takeaways that I think Democrats are having to process at this moment. You also look at people who are showing up to vote for the first time. And remember, these first-time voters, they broke for Joe Biden 4 years ago. They broke for Donald Trump this year. So there's something about the Democratic messaging, the Democratic candidate, obviously, that didn't work.
And what's so notable as well, think about it. This is the first presidential election after Roe v. Wade was overturned. We spent a lot of time talking about split ticket voters. And the way to think about it may not be in the context of president versus Senate, but rather the fact that you still have people energized, with the exception of the state of Florida, around some of these measures, 10 different states to enshrine abortion rights. And yet Democrats thought that would be one of the energizing factors for them, and it just did not turn out that way.
Well, it was a ballot winner up until Donald Trump was on the ballot.
Yeah, and so when you talk about this idea of people who can sort of exist in different boxes and be parts of different categories, right, as we're seeing now with what Chuck Todd has called this realignment right now demographically of where the Republican Party is, there are people, and we have seen it now in states, who say, yes, let's enshrine abortion access and enshrine, protect abortion rights. And I also want Donald Trump to be in the White House. Again, Vice President Harris spent months casting these states as having Trump abortion bans, as she put it, and that did not resonate with some of the folks in these battlegrounds.
We've also seen this realignment in terms of what we've been calling the education gap, because we can't think of a better way to put it. But you're starting to really see this line. The line of demarcation is not about race necessarily and not necessarily about gender, but it falls on college-educated voters, non-college educated voters. I remember hearing a lot from the Democrats in the final days. Oh, Kamala Harris has such a diverse coalition. It's all the way from AOC on the left to Liz Cheney on the right. But that's all a party. That's an elite college-educated party.
And you talked to Jason Miller about this, a senior Trump advisor, just this morning, and he said something that I think is correct and that we've seen in this. Donald Trump has brought working class voters, period, across these racial lines, across these gender lines, into the Republican tent here. And that is different from what we've seen before. How long lasting is it? We'll see.
Marco Rubio said something similar. He said the only identity that matters in terms of these Latino voters is they're Americans.
And that is why you are hearing Democrats say we have to have a reckoning. We're hearing a lot of that word today because they have to look at the electorate differently, not in terms of different racial groups, but as you're saying, really meeting them, as one person said, where they are, talking to them about the issues they care about.
I keep thinking that half the country is waking up right this moment elated and cheering, and half the country is waking up this moment and saying, oh no, what's going to happen? Everyone's waiting for Kamala Harris to speak. Donald Trump did speak about healing. So what do you think as we go forward?
So I think this is an interesting question because there have been moments in the past when former President Trump, now President-elect Trump, has spoken about perhaps having a unifying message, and then that was not the message that he delivered. So I just look at the past 8 years of having covered him, of him having been in the public spotlight here. He is somebody who has been crystal clear about his day one and his first priorities, and most of them are pretty controversial, depending on where you sit in the political spectrum here. So I think that is, I think back to Inauguration Day 2016, American carnage. He closed his campaign on this dark and defiant message, and so he doesn't have much incentive. He won the popular vote for the first time since he's been running for president in 3 cycles. He looks like he's going to do very well on some of these battlegrounds, too. He has no incentive to change.
I wouldn't be surprised if the message we hear from Vice President Harris is more unifying in tone. Former Congresswoman Liz Cheney posted on X saying we have to accept these results. That's what our democracy is about.
That's exactly right.
All right.
Hey, thanks for watching. Don't miss the Today Show every weekday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 Pacific on our streaming channel, Today All Day. To watch, head to today.com/allday or click the link right here.